Good evening, Rabbi Patrick. This is the last in my video responses in our shiur on Theodicy. And let me say at the start, although we've been doing this remotely, I've found it a very meaningful exploration of a lot of foundational ideas that will be central and important to my rabbinate, however it evolves. So thank you for your thoughtfulness and your intensity throughout. So I spoke with one of my closest lifelong friends, my friend who was my college roommate at Harvard for 2 years, and who we've lived through life's ups and downs and challenges. We come from very different religious approaches in our upbringings. I would say that he is really one of the most thoughtful people I know, and essentially would characterize himself as a person who doesn't believe in the typical transcendent God. And certainly his religious observance is, there are times during the year, but it's pretty minimal. So prayer, or at least traditional prayer, isn't really a central part of his life. Judaism is very important to him as a part of his identity, a part of his sense of his family's identity. He takes great pride in hosting an annual Hanukkah party and sharing his perspectives on the significance of the holiday. So, say he grew up in the Reform tradition to some extent, but without a strong daily or even weekly ritual practice. He, for the past 10 years, has been the head of a major urban hospital. So that includes during the whole COVID period, that the article from the Times of Israel discusses in detail in terms of the ultra-Orthodox response. And I would tell you that the hospital he is the CEO of has a very significant ultra-Orthodox population. So what it felt like to have the conversation was pretty interesting in the sense that I came to the conversation believing that he and I had very different theological views. And any discussion of theodicy really has to start with a theological discussion. Because if you don't start with a belief in the premise of an omnipotent and an all-good God that controls outcomes in the world, then, which frankly I don't, then the question becomes a different question, and problematic, probably still problematic why suffering happens in the world, but problematic in a different set of ways. And my buddy Ken I think doesn't have that theological perspective or belief. But what surprised me was that as the conversation unfolded, I felt like um, a lot of our theological differences uh, were much smaller than I thought they would be, instinctively. And perhaps some were semantic. Um, um, for instance, I see human beings seeing meaning in their lives as a reflection of God being present. I don't think he sees that, but he certainly sees that human beings do find meaning in their lives, and he finds meaning in his life. Uh, and this work that he's doing is very meaningful to human well-being. Um, he starts with the view that a commitment to science being the explanation for the world and what happens in the world as being somehow contradictory to a belief in God. I, I do not, but those differences in terms of how they play themselves out and how we live our day-to-day lives were smaller than I thought they would be. Um, so of course, this discussion leads to a very basic and important question of how do you find meaning in your life? Where did the meaning in your life derive from? And I thought it was interesting that um, uh, we both found a tremendous amount of meaning in human connection. Um, Ken has said for a long time that one of the most important things you can do as a human being, or one of the most important traits, is to be known and to have that knowing be really aligned with who you really are. Reminds me of a Buber um, concept that there are sort of three concentric circles that make up the human being. Um, the external, what the world thinks of you, the what you think you are, and the internal, what you are. And the more those circles are aligned and the less gap there are between those circles, the better a person you are. I think that's conceptually something that Ken really believes in strongly, um, as do I. So um, what I would also say is that um, we both believe in how important the story is that we tell ourselves about our lives. Um, Not just him and me, but what human that capacity to create a story that underscores why your life has meaning is a really fundamental driver of goodness in the world. Those are my words, not his, but conceptually, I think we're pretty closely aligned on that. And that coping with suffering, as painful as it is, ends up being one of the most important sources of human meaning. Um, I would share that I've come to a way of thinking about this in my own life that um, when our son Declan passed at 2.5, our third child, um, that was sort of the great inflection point in my life. And um, I thought of our process. My story was that I was not going to let that pain and hardship defeat me and make me a negative person and bitter person. Uh, and in a way, I had to live my story and tell myself that truth by adopting. Uh, and we adopted two children. And that was part of how I understood not just how I coped with the grief of our son's passing, but how I derived meaning going forward. And so when our older boy, um, our first adopted boy, really started struggling in his young adult life and adolescent life, uh, that was really destabilizing to my story. Um, it was sort of that wasn't supposed to be. I was supposed to have um, created this goodness by continuing to take risk in life and connection by adopting actually both of our sons. And um, there was sort of a naive sense of happily ever after should be the outcome. And when that wasn't the case, the story I'd been telling myself was really undermined. Uh, so there, the suffering was calling into question the story I'd been telling myself. And so what has occurred for me over the course of coping with our son's challenges is actually a process of creating a new story. And becoming a rabbi is a central part of that new story. Um, and through the experience of the learning in PRS and the identity development as a rabbi, and yes, a new chapter of suffering, um, while painful, it also has been uh, an essential step in creating a new story. Story with a very different set of perspectives on even the earlier chapters. So, um, my own view in the end, Rabbi Patrick, is that um, the Odyssey doesn't um, undermine my view of God. Uh, the fact that suffering in the world exists is a given in every human life. And uh, my perspective through the course of this course, pretty close to a Kushner perspective, I suspect, is that the process of living with suffering and living with pain is an essential element in how human beings create meaning. And for me, human beings finding meaning is probably the most fundamental way of experiencing God in one's life. So I guess I should have turned the question around a little bit, the Theodicy question around a little bit over the course of these lessons. Anyway, thank you for letting me share, and look forward to continuing this discussion with you over time.